there's not a lot to really talk about in terms of this focus today, disability histories. You know, we are encouraged to think about disability history for a month each year now, which is good. I'm not knocking that. That's better to think about it for 1 month than no months, as it were. But one of the things, obviously, for colleagues in this room and students in this room is that we do think about those things all through the year. So we didn't run this event in that particular month, as it were. This is a bigger event in the sense that we are always focusing on different aspects of disability, disability studies, and that obviously includes history. In many ways, you could say that history is always breathing down the neck of the present and therefore breathing down the neck of futurity. So it'd be foolish to try to escape history and the lessons it might learn. And I know that lots of colleagues today will be exploring those things in many different ways. So really what I just want to say at this point then is thanks, as I say, to all students and colleagues here from Liverpool Hope and directly related to the CCDS. Thanks to everyone who's come from, you know, different parts of the country and so on. And I would like to extend a special thanks to Professor Robert McCrew, who's our special guest today, who's been joining us for many years in the CCDS. And indeed, 10 years ago, he actually was a respondent here on a different book on changing social attitudes. And he's certainly been to many conferences and been involved in JLCDS from the start. So I would extend that thanks from all of us. And indeed, when we're thinking about CCDS work, the last issue that I submitted to the publisher, which will be the second this year to be published, is Cryptistemologies Now, which is essentially the third issue on cryptistemologies. But people who know this work well will know that 10 years ago we published the first two, and then 10 years on we will be publishing this one. So all thanks to Lisa and Robert for that brilliant work that I've been privileged to read very recently and very closely, and I know that everyone's going to enjoy that work. All the CCDS work that we are focusing on right now is the Autocritical Disability Studies book series, which will be touched on in this session implicitly and explicitly. I know that Ella Houston, for example, has a book in press now in that series, so that's well on its way. And Owen Barden is working on a book that's under contract for that series. And the reason I mention that series is because we do have an open call at the moment for cultural stations of disability. I've had quite a lot of interest in that call, so if anyone is thinking of submitting something, then please do. You've still got a week. The deadline is a week from today, and thanks to all of you who have already sent material for that. So that's just to show that the work is ongoing and obviously has that sustained engagement with disability studies. I'm sorry, I think I've moved the mic in a way that's slightly problematic, so let me just pull that down for the next. Okay then, well, as I say, I'm going to hand over now to Dr. David Feeney, who is going to chair the first session. So maybe you could show your appreciation for the coming session, please.
Hi, good morning everybody. I hope you're all doing okay. So I am David Feeney. I work here in Disability Studies, and I've been asked to help facilitate the first panel. I think we're probably a little bit short of time, so I won't hang around. I just thought I would mention that whenever I hear about an academic undertaking with a focus on history, I always remember that the very first book of philosophy I ever read, at least the version of it I read, was translated as on the advantages and disadvantages of history for life. It was written by one of these German idealists who kind of scratched their reflections into a journal as they're gallivanting through Bavarian countryside. And this philosopher, when he was walking through fields, he expressed envy in one of the pages for the cows and sheep that he encountered on his walk. And he was envious because those animals were incapable of summoning a long perspective to position their every lived moment within an historical perspective. And so the philosopher said that the animals are unencumbered by the potentially stifling weight of history. And so I was very impressionable at the time, even more impressionable than I am now. And for a long time, I thought that history was the devil, and I didn't want history within an acre of me. But then I started working in disability studies. I started appreciating how important history is, the unwritten histories of marginalized people, the history of disability activism, the life histories of people with acquired impairments, and how essential it is that we factor an appreciation of those histories within an understanding of the contemporary lived experiences of people with impairments. So this morning, 3 of my colleagues are going to talk and present, I think, very diverse perspectives on history. So my understanding is that we're going to listen to each of the 3 speakers who'll talk for approximately 20 minutes, and then at the end, time permitting, we will open it up for questions. So the first speaker is my colleague, Dr. Ella Houston, who's going to talk to us, who's going to present a paper entitled From Misfortune to Mainstream, The Evolution of Representations of Disability in Advertising.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming, and thank you David for such a great introduction. I'm Ella Houston, I'm a core member of the CCDS and a senior lecturer here at Liverpool Hope University. Is the mic working okay, or do I need to bring it a bit closer? It's okay. So thank you in particular to Professor David Bolt for the opportunity to present alongside my CCDS colleagues as part of this panel. Up until a few decades ago, portrayals of disability in advertisements were either absent or abysmal. Before the 1980s, the only advertisements that featured disabled people were charity fundraising appeals, promotions for rehabilitation and mobility aids, or pharmaceutical appeals. The disastrous ways in which tales of misfortune in charity advertisements have warped societal attitudes towards disability are well documented. As Susan Scott Parker's foundational 1989 report on disability and advertising states, in quotes, "No one is simply a potential donor to charities. They are also people who directly influence the day-to-day lives of disabled people everywhere." Meanwhile, historical depictions of people with physical and sensory impairments in advertisements for rehabilitation and mobility aids sold the idea that disabled people's chances of societal integration depend on medical and physical interventions. However, over the last few years, even the most cursory glances at television advertising breaks, magazines and billboards reveal that disabled people are far more noticeable in advertising. Even though disability now features in a volume and variety of advertisements, from billboards to some of the biggest brands across the world, to promotional videos created by disabled social media influencers who act as brand spokespeople, the legacies of ableist advertising persist. As Professor Bolt contends in his development of the ableist advertising aesthetic, in quotes, "Advertising that utilises disability certainly remains problematic, often framing disabled people in extreme terms, overtly negative or ostensibly positive." Here I've included an image of my forthcoming book, which Professor Bolt mentioned is featured in the Autocritical Disability Studies series. And the book argues that we cannot fully understand societal attitudes towards disabled people without analysing representations of disability in advertising that reach billions of people across the globe every single day. As stated by Raymond Williams, the history of advertising is vast, given that it is, in quotes, as old as human society. During the Iron Age, Greek potters used trademarks and mottos to create distinctive appeal for their goods, whereas posters promoted local products and events in the ancient cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, while town criers drew attention to nearby businesses during the medieval period. Moving forward to the 17th century, factual, to-the-point adverts appeared in newspapers and news pamphlets, while promotions for so-called freak shows featuring people said to have body anomalies emerged as some of the earliest representations of disability in advertising. Advertising, as we know it now, rapidly developed during the period of the Industrial Revolution, which involved the global expansion of industrialisation across the 18th and 19th centuries, with the shift from local to national and then global trading necessitating mass communication between businesses and consumers. Concurrently, advances in printing technology enabled the vast dissemination of advertisements via newspapers and posters. My forthcoming book highlights that cultural disability studies has paid nowhere near as much attention to advertising in comparison to literature, film, or television. The ephemeral rather than enduring nature of advertisements means that the power of advertising to shape societal attitudes is often underestimated. However, as Belcampole's foundational analysis of advertising's impact on society suggests, advertisements are important historical records because they selectively promote the characteristics most coveted in society. While you will find more in-depth and nuanced portrayals of disability in literature, television, film and radio, they don't match advertising in pervading the lives of mass audiences. Moreover, given that advertisements aim to seduce audiences, their messages surrounding disability are intended to be persuasive and agreeable, encouraging people to accept rather than critically dispute the claims that they make. Responding to the growing industrialisation of society, psychological and emotional appeals, playing on people's fears of not fitting into rapidly developing urban environments, became very popular in advertising. Advertisers promoted ableism by completely excluding people with impairments from images of beauty, desire, and scenes from everyday life. Meanwhile, the Industrial Revolution played a major role in shaping harmful perceptions of disabled people as pitiable rather than productive. Economic reliance on fast and physically demanding industrial labour led to fit and adaptable, non-disabled workers being perceived as the most valuable members of society. The conventions of factory work, including physically demanding labour, fast rates of production, long working days, and inaccessible workspaces, exacerbated ableism's obsession with abilities such as physical strength, seeing, and hearing. As eminent cultural disability studies scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson notes, this caused deep-rooted anxiety for individuals who might, in quotes, be virtuous workers one day and indolent paupers the next day. Thus emerges the magic promise of advertising, as Williams notes. Rather than selling objects, advertisements promote, in quotes, health, beauty, success, and the power to control your environment. As highlighted in Harlan Hand's groundbreaking work on disability in advertising, as a result of moving from rural to urban areas to join industrial workforces, members of society were increasingly conscious of how they appeared in public. Advertisements that played on people's personal insecurities flourished in the early 20th century, when the cosmetics industry came second to food manufacturers in spending the most money on advertisements. Advertisements emphasise the importance of self-transformation, persuading individuals to scrutinise their personal hygiene, health and appearance in order to improve their social and employment opportunities. As Nario Redmond suggests, the conflation of health, physical attractiveness and life opportunities promotes the ableist belief that physicality and beauty are the most important features of humanity. So featured on my slide here, I have an early advertisement for Listerine mouthwash. And I believe that this advertisement exemplifies advertising's emerging obsession with the apparent power of self-presentation to make or break an individual's chances of social integration. Although Listerine actually started out as a surgical antiseptic, from the 1920s onwards, it was promoted as a cure for bad breath, which was described as halitosis, a medical condition. And bad breath was framed as a source of shame and social rejection for many unsuspecting people. So the image I have on the board of this advert is a grayscale advertisement from 1928, and it shows a man caressing a woman who stares admiringly into his eyes. His back is turned against another woman who sits alone. We are encouraged to sympathise with the lonely woman. She is positioned at the front of the scene, literally cast aside in the corner, with a downcast expression on her face. The romantic rejection she experiences is emphasised by the tagline, "Halitosis makes you unpopular." The warning, "Don't fool yourself," in capitals, also features, with smaller text explaining, since halitosis never announces itself to the victim, you simply cannot know when you have it. The rejected woman's facial expressions communicate sadness, encouraging the audience to imagine themselves in her position. The implicit message is that individuals must remain vigilant in regards to their self-presentation, as any personal flaws you may have leave other people with no choice but to keep their distance from you. And this view promotes the ableist belief that social acceptance is an individual responsibility that is inextricably linked to self-presentation. So while the advertising industry has indeed promoted exclusionary attitudes and image-driven mindsets throughout society, reflecting processes of societal transformation is also a key aspect of advertising's history. Following the onset of the civil rights movement in the United States in 1954, the advertising industry targeted diverse consumer groups, slowly moving away from the explicit promotion of racial stereotypes. Moreover, greater numbers of black people gained employment in the advertising industry, and advertising agencies owned by black people emerged. For example, as Chambers Research reports, the Vince Colours advertising agency demanded change beyond treating, in quotes, black consumers as though they want to be white, end quote. The shift from black people mainly being portrayed as, in quotes, servants to being featured in professional environments reflects advertising's historical role in tracking gradual changes in societal attitudes. During the 1960s, tentative challenges to sexist stereotypes also emerged, with the advertising industry slowly realising that women are tired of only being featured as housewives or pretty objects. As the print advertisement for Virginia Slim cigarettes, which I've included on the slide, illustrates, brands also started to capitalise from feminist rhetoric. So in other words, drawing on slogans from feminist activism and the women's movement in quite tokenistic, superficial ways. So the advertisement I've included on the slide depicts an attractive woman with perfectly styled hair and makeup, wearing a fur coat while smoking a cigarette. And she is positioned next to the tagline, "You've come a long way, baby." The notion of consumerism and brand power as primary forms of self-empowerment that were promoted in advertisements that, in Tollan Ling's words, co-opted women's liberation slogans in order to frame brands as social pioneers. As I'll go on to discuss towards the end of my presentation, a similar trend is now noticeable in recent advertisements that appear to promote empowering approaches to disability. Although there were increasing moves away from racist and sexist stereotypes in advertising by the late 20th century, the promotion of ableism continued to be rife. Alongside the continuing popularity of charitable pity appeals, advertisements for rehabilitation and mobility aids emphasise the importance of disabled people striving to be productive and work-ready, as though their value can only be recognised if they are ready to work and ready to strive to be productive. Key research in this area, conducted by Thomas, found that advertisements for wheelchairs, prosthetic limbs and adaptive equipment stressed the importance of functional bodies above all else. Despite marking a change from patronising charity campaigns as they directly targeted disabled consumers, depicting people with impairments in the workplace, travelling, enjoying fitness and leisure activities, these advertisements sold the idea that rehabilitation and medical interventions are tickets to social integration for disabled people. As recent research by Burroughs uncovers, during this era, advertisements for hearing aids emphasised the importance of inconspicuousness, promoting the harmful idea that passing as non-disabled enhances a disabled person's chances of being accepted by society. An example of this trend is included on the slide. I've featured a print advertisement for Sonotone hearing aids, which features an image of two men wearing smart suits, as though maybe it's in the middle of a work day, and they're in a friendly embrace, as one says to the other, who is presumably wearing a hearing aid, although it's not at all visible, "Ed, it's made a new man of you. No one would ever know you're hard of hearing now." As research by leading scholars, including Haller and Ralph, Nelson and Longmore, has highlighted, since the late 1980s, advertisers have created innovative representations of disability. So in my forthcoming book, one of the arguments that I put forward is actually I think advertising has a lot to offer in terms of producing quite cool, quite dynamic representations of disability. I think it's misleading to assume that advertising is simply a foe of ours. So by the 1990s, major global brands such as McDonald's and Levi were including disabled actors in their advertising campaigns. Advertisers, in many ways, as part of the mass media industry, have been ahead of the curve in terms of representing disability. In recent years, consumer research has found that people are more likely to buy from brands they believe are socially responsible, and some are prepared to boycott brands who they don't think represent or acknowledge diversity. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, images of disability now feature across a volume and variety of advertisements. And as I mentioned in my book, advertisers are increasingly taking diverse approaches to representing disability. So some advertisers are drawing on crip humour, shock tactics that expose ableism, portraying disabled people as desirable and provocative characters, and celebrating disabled celebrities. Meanwhile, the growing popularity of social media marketing provides disabled social media influencers who work with brands opportunities to have more control over how they are represented in advertising than ever before. Contemporary advertising seems to be completely different from historical appeals that encouraged ableist attitudes, insinuating that endless self-scrutiny is the key to gaining societal acceptance. However, despite their positive appearances, recent advertisements that seem to promote diversity typically imply that change comes at a personal cost, giving the impression that anybody who has enough self-belief and determination can thrive in society exactly how it is without any changes. As Rebecca Feasey argues, despite promoting the rhetoric of choice, accessibility, agency and empowerment, these advertisements tend to only include models who do not pose too much of a challenge to the ableist beauty myth, despite perhaps using a wheelchair or having a visible impairment. Advertisements tend to now emphasise the importance of self-acceptance, implying that an individual's chances of happiness and being respected by other people hinges on their ability to cultivate self-belief and optimism. The problematic notion is that simple individual solutions provided by disabled people themselves are the most important ways of combating oppression. Whereas past advertising lauded the importance of constant self-scrutiny, contemporary, seemingly pro-diversity advertisements encourage marginalised identity groups, such as disabled people, to relentlessly practice self-belief, promising that can-do attitudes enable disabled people to overcome any barriers that they encounter. While appeals promoting the power of self-belief appear to be motivational, they indirectly suggest that the psychological and emotional wounds that ableist discrimination causes for many disabled people are signs of individual weakness as opposed to the painful byproducts of oppression. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Ella, for that fascinating talk. Our next speaker, who is my colleague, Dr. Erin Pritchard, a senior lecturer here in Disability Studies at Hope. And the title of her talk is A History of Cultural Representations of Dwarfism and Their Modern Day Impact.
Yeah, brilliant, thanks. Okay, so as David said, I'm looking at a cultural history of representations of dwarfism and some of the modern day impacts. So if anybody's aware of dwarfism, you've certainly seen it. It's always in TV, it's always in films, it's in fairy tales. It's always as an oddity. People with dwarfism always as a spectacle, something to own, a commodity, and this is extremely disempowering. And this has a long, long history. But as I should hopefully show, it is very much a culturally constructed representation, which has the ability to change, but we don't push it to change because there's this very disempowering, unequal sort of relationship between dwarfism and average-sized people. Because with height, smallness is never revered or respected. It's always seen as disempowering. And those are reflected, those notions are reflected in how people with dwarfism are represented. So, as David mentioned, he has the Autocritical Discourse book, which he's the chief editor of, and there's a whole collection of books. So my book, Midgetism, The Exploitation and Discrimination of People with Dwarfism, is featured in that series. And so I introduced this concept of midgetism. And first of all, it's like, well, hang on. Not long ago, she was saying that's hate speech. And yes, it is hate speech. Midget is a form of hate speech. Okay, just like any other slur that we'd associate with disabled people. But it's used freely. So I thought, I'm going to reclaim this term. Because a lot of people in society, when they see a dwarf on telly, they think that is you. They think that dwarf in the street is the same person. And they enjoy the same sort of behaviours. They have the same mindset. Okay, so we make this distinction. Midget was never a term really to describe someone with dwarfism, except in the freak shows. It has no medical connotations, but is instead related to the sort of sandfly or gnat and insect. It's dehumanising. Okay, as while some dwarfs still like to be dehumanised, most of us don't. So I reclaim this term midgetism because it's a combination, I suppose, of heightism and disableism. But when someone who is just short says, I know what it's like to be a dwarf, you don't want to just say, no, you're talking, out of, a different orifice. This is, you have no idea. You have no idea what it's like to have dwarfism. You don't get rented out. You don't have midgets shouted at you from a passing car. You don't have any of those experiences. You don't have to stand on a chair to give a lecture. Okay? You don't have to get pedal extensions. So it's different. And it's also different in the terms of, it's a part of disableism, because we are disabled people, but we don't fit into the nice sort of narrative or stereotype of disability. So this allows certain cultural representations of us. And so midgetism is a form of disableism, but it's something that's unique to people with dwarfism. So from midgetism, you have midget entertainment. So this is entertainment, like not what, you know, it's not someone with dwarfism in a soap opera or someone with dwarfism in Game of Thrones. It's someone with dwarfism in very derogatory representations, which we are all familiar with. And so any person with dwarfism that perpetuates that stereotype is called a midget entertainer. Because it's like, because midget was a term, as I will show later, derived from the freak show, where the only attribute you had to be in a freak show was your non-normative body. And in the case of dwarfism, it was just to be a dwarf. And so that's where that term was popularized. And so I feel any entertainment that reflects a freak show, or any person with dwarfism, is therefore a midget entertainer. They are a person with dwarfism, but they become, so it's not naming the person, it's naming the process, the phenomenon. So if we go back to ancient Egypt, this is probably the first time that people with dwarfism, or an only time people with dwarfism were actually respected. So they were revered as gods. There was plenty of people with dwarfism that were classed as gods in ancient Egypt. There was the god Bes, who was the god of childbirth. Okay, so they were revered. Then, because then they actually existed in real life, in ancient Egypt, they become prized by royalty. They become commodities by royalty. So these were the first notions of court dwarfs, but not in the notion that we would think of them. They weren't entertaining figures. They weren't court jesters. They were actually, they were given jobs like as, keepers of linen and weavers, and they had all sorts of indoor type of jobs. They didn't have to do the sort of heavy outdoor work. And so this is Senep. The image there is a Egyptian sculpture of Senep with his average-sized wife. They're interlocking arms. And below them is two sort of sculptures of their kids. So here it shows this, as Bolt would say, the forbidden relationship. It's a disabled and non-disabled person in a relationship with two children, and he was in the court of King Khufu, and so he was given these good roles. He wasn't treated as entertainment, he was revered. But that is as far as it goes in terms of respect for people with dwarfism. Because then we move on to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and as anybody knows, these had massive influences on Western society that we still feel today. So the philosopher Aristotle saw people with dwarfism as children or animals. That's what they were compared to, and it still carries on now, as we'll see later. Okay, so we haven't really developed from ancient Greece. All right, so they were really kept as pets. They were seen as just very much disrespectful, seen as something to be laughed at. This is where this notion of humour and dwarfism sort of comes from. However, there are very few depictions of women with dwarfism, because it was seen as taboo to sort of treat them in this, treat women in that same way, as to mock them. So again, if we link of notions of dwarfism and representations, 90% of the time it's a man with dwarfism. And there's a very masculine interplay there where they get to own the dwarf and have power over another male. But in ancient Rome, they were depicted with gladiators, so they were often fought against gladiators, or they would be fighting amongst themselves, which is very much, as I'll show later, associated with midget wrestling. Okay? And they were also thrown across the arenas or wherever they were. So again, like midget tossing. So we haven't really developed from ancient times. So then if we move forward to the European courts, during the 18th and 15th to the 18th century, dwarfs were kept as pets. They were traded as gifts. There's the famous story of a queen receiving a huge pie, and then a dwarf jumps out of it, and she's so happy because then she's got her own dwarf to keep. Quite frankly, I think it's much better to own a Pomeranian or something, not a dwarf, but that was those times. Okay, so they were always seen as a source of amusement, but they was always argued. So we had this backward argument that, you know, that it was a form of employment and financial security, because what else could dwarfs do? Well, that is putting the blame on the person with dwarfism, not societal structures that discriminate them. So I can't blame them if they got a good life, but, you know, to be kept as a pet is very degrading. Sorry. So then the freak shows, and this is probably the most influential place where, you know, of a representation of dwarfism. So in that image, there is an image of P.T. Barnum, which is probably the most famous freak show owner, who in 2017, his life was depicted in The Greatest Showman by Hugh Jackman. So we had this very ableist whitewashing, that he was great, he rescued these freaks. No, he kidnapped them or he bought them off the families. And he made them perform. He exploited and oppressed them for his own financial gain. But we wouldn't admit that, would we? Because, you know, we prefer to see him rescuing these poor freaks than see that this average-sized, able-bodied man with lots of opportunities actually relies on disabled people for money and on racist tropes as well. So it's a sepia image, and next to him is Tom Thumb, General Tom Thumb. His real name is Charles Stratton. But P.T. Barnum gave him this name, Tom Thumb, because Tom Thumb is of Arthurian legends, and he was as big as your thumb. So again, it's all about his height. It's, you know, and general, it creates this incongruous encounter, because there is no way on earth a person with dwarfism, especially someone that short, is ever going to be in the army. But they would dress him up in sort of military clothing, and he'd have pretend sword fights with a dog and stuff. So that's how exploitative it was, and how just humorous this whole, you know, show was. So they were collected for the amusement of others, and as Gerber states or suggests, the exhibition of people with bodily differences, also known as freaks, is a form of social oppression and exploitation which contributes to the reproduction of prejudices and discrimination that they face. Okay? Now, again, it was seen as a form of employment, but this is the problem. What about the disabled structures? And as you know, Dr. Houston was saying about the Industrial Revolution, this was at around the same time. You know, it was only the strong that could work, and disabled people were then shunned out of employment. So they were put in the freak shows instead, but not all disabled people. Only certain disabled people were put in freak shows. Those were very different bodies, like people with gigantism, people with dwarfism, conjoined twins, that kind of thing. Okay. Now, they began to diminish around the turn of the 20th century. This was mostly for ethical reasons, because we became sort of enlightened, where it was seen as these are people with medical conditions, and we are exploiting them and putting them on stages and laughing at them. However, they seem to forget, they neglected dwarfs in that, because dwarfs found other ways to be exploited. So this is the kingdom of little people in China. So in ancient China, they had loads of courts with dwarfs in them. Okay, court dwarfs were very popular in ancient China. But still today, in 2009, as recently as 2009, and it's still open, is the kingdom of little people. And it's this theme park, but it's not a theme park with roller coasters or anything like that. It's a theme park which is like this fake fantasy land. It's got these, you know, medieval sort of turrets and buildings and stuff, where all these dwarfs live. Now, this plays on the notion that dwarfs come from a separate race, that we're always a separate race of people. And that's why I often, you know, like I said before, we often get asked, is your family like you? And it's like, well, of course. You wouldn't go up to a wheelchair user or somebody who's got a visual impairment and go, so does all your family use a wheelchair? Does all your family have a white cane? Okay, 80% of people with dwarfism are born to average-sized parents. But there's this notion that we all live up in the mountains somewhere. So in this theme park, people pay to go and pick up dwarfs, watch them dance. Okay, they're not necessarily performers. They don't really have any qualifications like in singing and dancing or anything. It's just to see dwarfs and stuff perform. And you can see videos of them where people are running after them, picking them up and getting photos taken with them. And so whilst it has been criticised by some disability organisations as, you know, reflecting this notion of a human zoo, it's had very little criticism because the owner, who is an average-sized man, says again that he would face discrimination. I'm giving them work. He neglects to say that they are making him a lot of money, you know, from this theme park. And if you actually see some videos of these people with dwarfism, they don't like these places. Just like Tom Thumb, who used to wake up crying at night because he did not like being exploited. But we forget that because it's easy then, because then we can still say it's a job for them. So we'd say, oh, that's China though. China's not, you know, as good. But here we have dwarfs for hire. We have cheeky events. We have several organisations in the UK that hire out dwarfs. Hello. As they are seen as nothing but forms of amusement. So there's an image there of basically a woman hired out a dwarf for her wedding because she said nobody would expect that. I was like, yeah, because nobody is, you know, stupid enough to do that. Sorry?
Technical.
Okay. And so, as you can see in that image, it's of a wedding. It's not a kind of wedding I'd want to go to because it looks pretty boring. There are two round tables there, and they're practically empty. The audiences have got their backs to the dwarf. Maybe they're a bit ashamed to be seen there. You know, she's got 3 kids. She could have got them running around the table. But she hired out a dwarf instead. And he is pointing with this, you know, grin at the camera. And he's dressed in a tuxedo. So again, it creates this incongruous encounter. Because he's a man, but he's so small. And his whole job was to run around those tables to the Benny Hill circus theme music. So you can hire them out. And as the cheeky event says, they are one of the very few agencies that can provide you with male or female dwarfs for hire across the length and breadth of the UK. Dwarfs are a spectacle to add to any corporate event, private party or prenuptial celebrations. Our midget hire service is popular for stag and hen do's as it's a funny addition to your night. Whether you're planning a trip around town or staying in, our friendly and professional dwarfs will bring belly laughs to your party. Now, the belly laughs aren't because they're comedians or anything. They don't have these talents. They are just there, like, to run around tables, and that's what you laugh at. You know, or you can handcuff yourself to a dwarf. Now, change that word dwarf to some other disability or ethnic minority. I don't think that agency would be allowed to exist. But they are complete ownership. Your dwarf, our dwarf service, our midget hire. Okay? It's all about owning your very own dwarf. And so, who does this? You'd think it would just be certain people, wouldn't you? But Princess Eugenie, you know, Prince Andrew's daughter, not very respectable, I know, but, you know, for her 25th birthday party, she dressed up as Snow White. Okay. And she hired 7 dwarfs, probably courtesy of the taxpayer, from cheeky events. And so they were dressed up as the typical 7 dwarfs, and they followed her everywhere. And as it said, the princess made sure she danced with each of them, while friends who wanted to dance with them had to ask her permission because they were her retinue. Wherever Snow White went, her 7 dwarfs dutifully followed. So they're like, you know, following her like some sort of commodity. And if you want to dance, you've got to ask her. This is a party. Maybe it was a party in Pizza Express, Woking, I don't know. Okay? Well, you know, no sweat. But again, you know, this is a woman who's going to get a lot of popularity, who's going to get a lot of attention, and she's hiring out dwarfs. What does that say about the royals and their notion of disability, how they think about disabled people? Okay, now in Saudi Arabia, Prince Ali, he also has a court of dwarfs, and they're jesters. And because he says, oh, well, it's charity, it's an act of charity, they won't be able to get jobs anywhere else in Saudi Arabia. There's 2 problems with that. Okay, there's other disabled people, but you're only doing it for people with dwarfism. I'm not saying to go and hire out any other disabled people, by the way. But also, as a prince, he has that power to change those discriminatory attitudes in Saudi Arabia. If he can reinforce the, you know, discriminatory attitudes towards women there, he can also challenge them. But he chooses not to, so that says more about him. Okay, and hiring out the dwarfs, because of course then it's an act of empowerment. He owns them. If you want to dance with them or if you want to be anywhere near them, you've got to ask, just like with Princess Eugenie. Okay, thanks. Okay, so then we have this. This is like, okay, it developed in Australia in the 1980s, known as midget tossing. Okay, but it's reflective of ancient Rome, where gladiators would throw people with dwarfism. Only I don't think the men in that image look anything like gladiators. Okay, they are tossers because, well, they're tossing a dwarf, aren't they? A dwarf dressed up as Superman. Yeah, really, he's such a superhero. Again, this is incongruous encounter. So they get to throw him like a ball. He is dehumanized. Okay, they could just go to a darts tournament, but they choose to throw a dwarf because it's, look at me, look how strong and masculine I am. And the dwarf doesn't realize he is being laughed at. But this is probably the only opportunity he gets to be on a lad's night out. Okay, and then there's the midget wrestling. Again, I've been told they fight with passion and everything, but really they're just there to be laughed at. So here's an image of The Undertaker, who is kneeling down, a very famous wrestler, kneeling down next to his doppelganger, the mini Undertaker, or sometimes people call him the under-toddler, because again, this is notion of infantilization, which disempowers the dwarf. And so as Mark Seeley, aka Little Leg, says, a midget wrestler, I personally don't do a lot of training because I don't need to pick up a 6-foot bloke. No, what Mark Seeley means is he cannot pick up a 6-foot bloke. But he's still trying to hide this fact that he's a strong man. He's 3 foot odd, okay? He's not going to really win a wrestling competition against The Undertaker. Even if it is staged, it's still unbelievable. Okay, so this was from the carnivals and Victorian sideshows, so of course it's dwarfism. And they are used as comic fodder, so you can see them biting somebody's ass or pinching someone's nipples or dry humping someone's legs, something the other wrestlers would never do. Okay, but the dwarfs do it. So, and the excuse, it's a job for them. And Warwick Davis says this. Warwick Davis, who's meant to be a patron of dwarfism equality, says that it's our bread and butter. We have to do the pantomimes. What he neglects to say is it's his bread and butter because he does the pantomimes and has an agency that hires out dwarfs. Not in the same sense as cheeky events, but still hires out dwarfs. So they're saying that the only thing we can do is entertainment. And yet most of us don't work in entertainment. I haven't worked in entertainment for years. But it's this social construct that has existed throughout history that we are a form of amusement for others. But I say to people with dwarfism, surely we should be tackling that and be more empowering to ourselves and have more respect. So are the changes? I'm just going to, this one. So there is a dwarf being hired out for a baby shower. The people that have hired them out, a pregnant woman and her husband. I don't know if he is the baby's father. They've got their faces blurred. I don't know if it's through embarrassment or what. But yeah, he's dressed up in a big baby grow with a big oversized dummy, and he hires himself out for baby showers. Like I said, 80% of people with dwarfism are born to average-sized families, so I wonder what would happen if that child that she's carrying actually had dwarfism. So like he says, people should mind their own business. If we are happy, leave us to get on with our lives. He doesn't speak for every person with dwarfism. He speaks for himself and the minority of midget entertainers that do that kind of thing. But again, it's always portrayed that we all do it through his attitude. So to conclude, we have always been constructed as commodities, except in ancient Egypt. There's this notion of ownership. They've been constructed by average-sized people, but reinforced by midget entertainers. They are culturally constructed to have the potential to change. Okay, whilst most of us do not engage in midget entertainment, a minority, encouraged by the right-wing media, still perpetuate the myth that we do, but we get the impact, we get the social impact. So we're meant to be activists here, so there's a couple of petitions. There's one to ban midget tossing, and there's one to get rid of a pub in Abingdon called The Midget at the moment, so to rename it, because you wouldn't call it anything else, would you? You know? But thank you.
So moving along to our next speaker, we're going to hear from my colleague Professor Claire Penketh, whose paper is entitled Histories of Disability and Art Education, Insights from the National Art Education Archive.
Thank you. You're all quiet as mice. Is everybody all right? Yeah, you're all very welcome. I just want to say very quickly, thank you very much to David for setting up this event and for gathering everybody together, and we can say more about that, but thank you very much. And thanks to David for the introduction. On your tables, some of your tables, there's a little, I don't know, Tintin said zine. You say potato, I say patata. The zine is related to the work that I'm going to talk about, and it's just a little thing that you might want to take away with you. So it's summarising some of the ideas, and I was just playing with those ideas in a physical form. But it does talk to this idea of the physicality of the archive that is something that I want to address in this talk. So the presentation centres on the use of materials from the National Art Education Archive. And this underpinned research for Chapter 6 of my recent book, A History of Disability and Art Education. The book offers a revisionist approach to established histories of art education, but this chapter focuses on the relationship between disability and art education in British schools, more specifically in the late 20th century. A period that has had little scrutiny because the histories of art education that we have focus largely on the period from 1870 through to the 1950s. At this time, US art educator Doug Blandy had appealed to art teachers to reject the medical prescriptive model of disability, arguing that art education was a subject well placed to adopt a social orientation. In the UK, disabled artists and activists were beginning to make significant contributions to cultural politics. However, art educators, academics, advocates, as well as practitioners appeared to take little account of these changes. And in the book, I argue that one of the reasons for this inability to reorientate at this time of significant social and cultural change was a preoccupation with multiple significant reforms. So there was the introduction of the national curriculum, the implementation of the Ofsted regulatory framework, and the embedding of the then new approach to special educational needs, which left teachers in a constant state of defence, and that's referenced in a lot of the papers published at the time. This presentation then focuses on primary research using archival materials from the National Art Education Archive. And on the slide here, I've only got 4 slides, and I've used the zine sort of aesthetic there. And I'll just talk through, the talk is going to then just talk a little bit about the archive, the process of looking for disability in the National Art Education Archive, a particular collection, the Terence Finn collection, and a little bit of a touching on temporal flexibility and agency, and again that's explored more fully in the chapter. On the right-hand side is the front cover of the zine, which has a little quote there from Terence Finn, the collection that I'm going to talk about, and also includes the book cover. I have to say the book at the moment is £130, whereas it was £4.20 to get 22 zines printed. So, take the zine. The NAEA then houses, sorry, I think I just jumped a massive bit, okay. So the National Art Education Archive, on the second slide here, there are 2 photographs of the archive, and they're basically just the rooming there with some windows that overlook the sculpture gallery in Yorkshire. On the right-hand side, we can see the shelves of the archive as well, and the logo from the National Art Education Archive. So the National Art Education Archive was established in 1985 and is contained in the Lawrence Batley Centre in the grounds of Yorkshire Sculpture Park. This was the home of Bretton Hall College of Education, which was founded in 1949 by art educator Alec Clegg. And it was a place where there was innovative arts-based pedagogies that characterised much of what was now described as progressive education in the 1960s and 70s. This was a time that might make some of us nostalgic for the kinds of value given to the arts in post-war education in Britain, Europe and the US. The NAEA houses a library along with an extensive range of archival material relating to national and international art education from the mid-19th century to the present. It holds unique documents, artworks and artefacts which have formed the basis of exhibitions and publications, enabling historical insights into international developments in art education. Whilst volunteers continue to catalogue materials, a number of its corpuses have remained unexamined, including the Terence Finn collection, which is featured here. And I would just want to touch on, we've got Vicky Dwyer here from the Royal School for the Blind, who's brought some work from the archives at the Royal School for the Blind on the table at the back, and just to get a sense of this real sort of physicality of working with archival material. It's a very, very different experience, so thank you for bringing that in. So looking for disability in the NAEA. Archives suggest to me a structured collection of material. However, Hill, writing in 1993, refers to the processes by which materials come to be placed in archives as quite mysterious. Why are some materials kept? Why are some catalogues digitised whilst others are neglected? In these unexamined archives, it's difficult to know exactly what you'll find, and even more difficult to understand how and why those particular items have been placed there. The systematic and logical approach implied by research is challenged by the serendipitous findings that come from sifting through large boxes of disordered images and documents. Although we might happen on interest in archives, we must also appreciate the extent to which some of the materials there have become decontextualised, decoupled from the original place and modes of production. Hill advocates for researchers then to talk to the archivists prior to accessing material in order to benefit from them from their informed starting point. In the case of the NAEA, a first response suggested that there was very little material relating to disability, since few of the collections represented work from special schools. Disability, it seemed, was barely there, a condition experienced by Grayson Brilmer, a disabled archival researcher who anticipates their absence from the histories they research. There is an expectation that disability will be scarcely represented, missing, or at least very difficult to find. In this case, I was directed to the Terence Finn collection, a compilation that the archivist felt was explicit in its relationship with disability, since it represented the work from specialist settings and a pupil referral unit, or PRU, a form of segregated schooling for young people who have experienced difficulties often associated with negative behaviours. Can I just check, is my pace okay? Because sometimes I'll start to rattle on. Okay, thank you. Of significance here is the absence of disability, as well as the conditions for its presence. Archivists perceived disability to be absent from other collections, but were able to locate disability easily in the Terence Finn collection, since it was signified by the marker of special education. So the Terence Finn collection, and I'll talk to this slide in a minute. Whilst the archive is extensive, the Terence Finn collection is singular in representing art education in a segregated educational setting. Finn produced an extensive record of his work with pupils who attended a range of special schools for pupils labelled with emotional and behavioural difficulties, a now outmoded term of EBD, including pupils from PRU's, pupil referral units. And that was between 1987 and 2018. The material includes photographs, planning materials, evaluations, but they reflect Finn's particular interest in art education and art therapy. These materials reflected a time of educational reform where art education existed alongside the establishment of a single category of SEN, the newly established regulatory body, Ofsted, and the national curriculum, which offered a prescriptive approach to curriculum content as well as modes of assessment. Material included documentation from a conference on art education and special educational needs at Bretton Hall in Yorkshire in April 1996. The title, Against the Odds, indicating a sense of adversity governing art education and special educational needs at the time. Curiously, we're in that space again. Here Finn offered the context for his talk as one where art education had been relegated to a foundation subject as part of the national curriculum, and where a possible, quotes, visitation from the Ofsted team, unquote, would contribute to the increased regulation of the profession. His own specific context appears doubly marginalised, and he described the category of EBD as the neglected backwater of special needs. In his presentation, Art Education and the Vulnerable Fifth, Finn began by attending to his own early experiences of art education, empathising with those who were alienated by rigid educational practices. He notes, this is a quote, "The art room increasingly became my sanctuary, and the materials my flexible friends, through which to rescue some semblance of self-worth. It was within this less formalised learning climate that this particular, quote, slow learner found himself enabled to think and act authentically and assimilate things at his own pace." Finn acknowledges then the particularity of art practice in enabling alternative pedagogic relationships to form in a space that is defined by temporal flexibility. Here, art education is marked out as a subject unique in its capacity to enable learners to work outside of curriculum constraints. He continues, "Art education, perhaps more than any other area of the curriculum, provides individuals with the opportunity to grow and digest their experiences at their own pace. We owe it to ourselves and to the children that we work with to try and ensure that we retain a firm hold upon our capacity to feel and act creatively and compassionately in this present climate, when seemingly time-consuming ways of responding appear not to be particularly fashionable." Finn appeals then to human qualities of care and compassion as a means of enabling forms of resistance to the imposition of chrononormative expectations of the school curriculum. This ability to resist forms of temporal disablement and work beyond the usual time and space for learning indicates a degree of agency more achievable in the context of that pupil referral unit than to teachers working within mainstream constraints of the newly established national curriculum. Finn's approach is exemplified in his work with one of the pupils at the school in his notes on Case Study D, where Finn records the development of a sculpture. So I'm going to just refer to the slide here. On the right-hand side, there's an image of a life-size mod rock, which is plaster bandage figure, and there are two different views of that figure. And this is the sculpture that the person's talking about, that Finn's talking about. And the Case Study D is the young person who's making that piece of sculpture. So here, Finn's approach then is exemplified here. The descriptions of the making process and conversations between the pupil and the teacher are suggestive of a flexible and responsive form of pedagogy emerging from and responding to the learner's very personal interests and experiences, and one, importantly, which can take place beyond the usual time constraints of the classroom. D had started an ambitious project to create a life-size model of a figure using mod rock, the plaster bandage. And Finn describes how the work shifted to become a deeply personal response. So this is the quote on the slide. "Initially, D's model was allocated a male gender, but during the course of one evening session in which D talked about his mother's pregnancy and his feelings about being away from home during the week, he suddenly announced that he was going to change his model's gender and, quote, make her pregnant." Finn describes how after a weekend visit home, D returned to another evening art session with one of his sister's dolls, which he said he wanted to, quote, make a home for inside his mummy model. These evening conversations with a young person in residential provision are indicative of an engagement that moves beyond the normative framing of a typical school day. It also points to a mutual recognition of familial relationships, bringing the outside into the making process, as Finn recalls that his own wife had announced that she too was pregnant. In his conference address and through his interactions with pupil D, Finn discloses experiences at the intersection of art education and disability, which suggest a degree of agency that enabled him to resist temporal and structural limitations of the time. Whilst there's an irony in the freedoms afforded by this segregation, Finn's account speaks to the apparently unique role that art education had in expression, communication and realisation of the self for pupil and teacher. The positioning of art teacher as potential art therapist appears to have fuelled a desire for Finn's detailed documentation, yet he also maintained a commitment to demonstrate and celebrate the value of the pupil's artwork, not as a site for remediation, but as a means of acknowledging and valuing their lives and learning. He organised exhibitions of pupils' work, ensuring that this was celebrated beyond the immediate confines of the PRU. In this example, there is no attempt to regulate the pupil's creative practice and no reference to the restrictive assessment regimes, mechanisms that were being treated with increasing degrees of scepticism by mainstream art educators of the time. However, there are tensions in representing work from the collection. Whilst permissions to use images may be granted by the archive, I felt less comfortable presenting photographs of the young people who may have granted Finn permission to photograph them without the awareness of how those images could eventually be used. In one image, a sleeping boy lies on the floor of the art room. Hood up, lay on his side. The photograph might suggest sleep as art performance, or simply the passive act of a sleepy teenager. How do the arts practice of case study D and the sleeping boy speak to the relationship between disability and art education? Is it right that these representations are mined in this way? So, some concluding remarks. The Terence Finn collection provides an extensive range of materials produced at a significant time in British education and allows deep insights into art education within the context of segregated systems. However, I'm convinced that disability must be present in other parts of the archive. In more recent work, I came across the Ruth Mock collection, 1A1 and 1A3 box, which include autobiographical notes and papers, articles and reviews written during and after Mock's time as an art advisor in Yorkshire between 1946 and 1950. This collection also includes paintings by patients in a so-called mental hospital. Another collection contains correspondence with art educator Marion Richardson, who also experienced mental ill health. Without close archival work, the extent of the historical relationship between disability and art education cannot be fully appreciated. This exploration of primary research is particularly pertinent when established histories of art education have failed to take account of disability. Whilst the archive offers the potential for insights into art education and its relationship with disability, my engagement with the NAEA raised questions about the location of disability, and more particularly, its sole location in collections representing segregated schools. This reflects the continued impact of separations and examples of working with disability at a curricular level. It reduces our capacity to acknowledge past examples of working with disability at a curricular level. It also limits our ability to imagine the contributions of disabled artists, teachers, as past and present producers of culture and creators of artful pedagogies. A final word, I'll finish with a return to Finn's request to art educators to retain a firm hold upon our capacity to feel and act creatively and compassionately in our present climate. This is an appeal that reaches from the past into our present moment.
Okay, thanks Claire, and thanks to all of our speakers. We do have some time. I think we've just under 10 minutes or so left for questions. So there is a roving mic somewhere. So if anybody has any questions for any of the speakers, if you just bring yourself to my attention, we'll get a mic to you. I know it's always difficult in situations like this to be the person to ask the first question. Oh, David, okay.
Sorry. Oh, sorry, Brian.
I wonder while I'm waiting, could I ask a question? Because I have the mic in front of me. So I just thought I'd start with you, El, because you were the first speaker. Just when you were talking about history in the context of advertising, you did make a few references to Raymond Williams's historical approach. And my understanding, at least a part of his work, is he talks about history as the interplay between residuality and emergence. So he says that actually one of the things that prevents new histories from emerging, or even new voices from emerging, is the continuing influence of residual or past voices. And I'm wondering, in the context of the history of advertisements, do you think, even though you did indicate that there is a tendency towards maybe attempts, whether they're genuine or not, attempts to make more positive or more affirmative representations of advertising, do you think that this movement might be impeded in some sense because it is building upon a very ableist and negative history of advertising?
Remember Junie.
To be honest with you, David, more than anything, that's given me a lot of food for thought for something that I might think about. I hadn't really thought too much of that. To be honest with you, I'm not really, before I started to write the book, I've always focused on contemporary advertising, post-2000. But I certainly think, I think now the idea of cultivating self-belief and, advertising now tells us to be comfortable in our skin, whoever we are and whatever barriers that we encounter. To my mind, that's a version of the message, so the residual message, change ourselves in order to be accepted, but rather than changing ourselves in an external way, it's more now changing ourselves in internal ways. So thanks very much for highlighting that, because that's really useful for me to think about.
Okay. I was just trying to fill an awkward pause as we were waiting for the mic.
You did really well. David.
Okay, David.
I'll just take the opportunity first to thank you, David, for chairing the session, and also to thank all three speakers. Really enjoyed the papers, and I'm obviously directing the question at all three speakers, and I just wondered if it's sort of a big question, but I was hoping you'd give me a short answer. And it's just really if we were to say about learning lessons from history as we're often thinking along those lines, what would be the lesson that each of you would suggest in relation to the work that you've been doing? What would be the single lesson you would want history to learn, as it were? What makes sense?
I'll take the mic and give it to someone else. Erin.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks, David. That's an interesting question. I think for me, to learn from history is that, as we saw in ancient Egypt, people with dwarfism, it wasn't a job for them to be entertainment, and this was in a much, more difficult time where we didn't have technology or anything that could allow them to work from home or work in, tertiary industries that might be easier for them, less pressure on, their secondary impairments. So it really does challenge that notion that we can only do entertainment, which is actually more damaging to our health, in the example of midget tossing, which can cause great spinal problems, and so can midget wrestling. So yeah, I think we need to recognise that if you're saying it's a job for us, it's because of how problematic your society is, not our condition. Thank you.
Thanks for the question, David. For me, I think one of the things that I've learned through doing the historical work is to be really cautious of those narratives So the modernist idea of continuous improvement and the fact that things are moving on and that we're going to have this gradual trajectory of working to some kind of ideal situation. So what I say is paying attention to individual contexts and thinking about contemporary context, but also being very aware when we're looking back on historical materials that either we do that without fully recognising what the context of that situation is. So being really aware in terms of the full range of ideas and attitudes, which is one of the reasons for the project in the first place, is not to be thinking about, for example, special educational needs. To me, it's a completely abstracted term, but thinking about it within the context of art education and those practices means that it makes sense within those practices. But I think the big thing for me is just to have caution around that trajectory for gradual improvement, because we always have to remain cautious and vigilant about what's happening now. Did you want?
Yeah, my answer is very brief, and my answer would be that we have to take seriously texts such as advertisements, newspapers, magazines, social media that form the mass media, and because I think that the way in which they portray disability can have massive implications for attitudes, but also, as the history of advertising has shown, the cost of being excluded from those representations that are prevalent in day-to-day life is massive. Thank you, David.
Irene.
Hi, thank you all very much. Yeah, it's more a comment than a question. It was just to David's inquiry and to Ella's response about the fact that advertising is one of the prime sites for the negotiation of ideology and its continued dominance. So how it incorporates, and I think it's very interesting that you're now talking about the fact that we are going internally, we're being corrected internally, or that's what's being encouraged, although that's seen as some sort of move or progress. Yeah, so that's all I really wanted to say, because it was that's why it's the Raymond Williams thing stands. But thanks anyway.
Any more?
Yeah.
Thank you for pointing.
This is a question for Dr. Erin Pritchard. I was very interested by everything that you said, and an aspect that I hadn't actually looked into. When it comes to, you talked about ancient Egypt and how different it was there any reasoning behind why that particular era or that particular place was better?
Well, we were revered as gods, so surely that's better. But I think, but like I think it's because those ideas. I don't know how those ideas were formed in Egypt, because obviously they had lots of gods and stuff. Cats were gods, and I agree with that. But then when you move on to ancient Rome and especially ancient Greece, where these notions of body and the ideal body come into play. People with dwarfism don't fit into that ideal, strong gladiator type body, or Olympian body that was reflected in many of the gods. So I think that's when you create this disempowering sort of representation of dwarfism. They're not strong, they're not powerful, so they're there to be mocked, because that would link to the superiority theory of humour. So that it's okay to laugh at them because you're better, and because you're always trying to emulate one of these gods. I think that's right, but thank you for the question.
Hi, sorry, it's a question for you, Erin, again. Just to ask, with the perpetuation of dwarf stereotypes in entertainment, would that relate back to advertising again? Because with the perpetuation of people with dwarfism only being able to work in entertainment, and that would be perpetuated again and again, wouldn't it be related to, say for example, in the Middle Ages or ancient times in China with court jesters, wouldn't that be perpetuated more because the document at the time was more focused on nobility and focused, and that's the way that people with dwarfism would only get mentioned, do you think? Sorry, that wasn't very coherent. Sorry.
So in terms of representations with advertisements, I think Ella has covered some elements that about how dwarves are represented in adverts, and usually something to be laughed at. There's only been recent depictions of people with dwarfism in good advertisement, which is Ellie Simmons in like British Airways, that kind of thing. When you talk about court dwarfs in China and sort of the court jesters and mobility, so you say because they have mobility impairments or something?
No, sorry, I meant being exploited by an upperly in ancient times and through medieval and stuff, because in terms of media around that time, you see documents reflecting mobility and pictures.
Oh,
So it's not, it's more, it's not, it's more that myth of the entertainment of, oh, that's so increasingly fine work, your dish is perpetuated, because that's what's been the most documented throughout history.
Oh, yeah.
They are going to be documenting the person with dwarfism who's working in the blacksmith route down the road.
No, you're right, there will be plenty of
That's
documentation.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I
No, that makes sense. So there's plenty of archival stuff, where they would be working for nobility in royal courts and stuff, as one of people with learning disabilities and stuff. But again, we would not carry on that trope necessarily into, you won't hire someone out with learning disability and go, oh no, but that's a job for them. But with dwarfism, because there's a distinction and it's more seen as a difference in a disability, that those two things, you're right, the archive and that have created this distortion.
Also, I just want to say, I think reclaiming that slur is a very good idea in this case, because it's just so common now.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'll just repeat
Yeah,
that. So, sorry, do you want to just repeat that? Because we didn't at the moment.
I think being able to reclaim a slur that is so common and so just completely chucked about with no thought is a good thing. It is a necessary thing. You have my support.